I think I remember yours too. From that day on, they stayed in contact. Laya began volunteering at the foundation, helping organize books in the children's library and packing care boxes for young mothers. As she grew older, she took an interest in medicine, pediatrics specifically. And when she was accepted into Stanford's medical program, the first person she called wasn't her father. It was Maya. "None of this would have happened without you," Laya said over the phone. "I didn't make your path," Maya replied. "I just helped you survive long enough to find it." Richard Langston, now semi-retired, continued funding the foundation in full, but even when his name was listed on plaques and brochures, he always insisted on being placed last, after the mothers, after the staff, after Maya. "I gave money," he often said. "She gave everything else." One of the most unforgettable moments in Maya's later life came during a speech she gave at the White House. By then, the Elijah Grace Foundation had helped over 250,000 women across the country. The president called her a national treasure, and a law had recently passed to increase federal protections and benefits for domestic workers, heavily influenced by her advocacy. She was asked to speak to a room filled with senators, business leaders, and global change-makers. She walked to the podium, dressed in a white suit her staff had insisted she wear, and began without a script. "When I was 27, I held a stranger's baby to my chest and fed her. I was afraid. I was grieving. I had lost my own child. And I thought maybe, just maybe, if I helped someone else's child live, I could keep from drowning. What I didn't know was that moment would save me, and would change everything else that followed." She spoke not just of her past, but of her future, of a world where caregivers weren't invisible, where grief wasn't shy, where love came not from titles but from presence. When she stepped off stage, people cried. When she returned home to her staff, they cried too. But Maya, she simply smiled, made tea, and went right back to work. She had no interest in resting on praise. There was still too much to do. In the final years of her life, Maya mentored young women who reminded her of who she used to be, tired, overlooked, but quietly burning with potential. One of them asked her once, "How did you know that one moment wouldn't ruin you?" Maya took a long sip of tea, looked out the window, and said, "Because I knew that moment wasn't the end. It was the beginning. I didn't know what it would lead to. I just knew I couldn't walk away from a crying child." On the 15th anniversary of the Elijah Grace Foundation, Richard Langston gave a speech on stage, now older, more silver-haired, more gentle than the world remembered. Laya, now a pediatric doctor herself, stood beside him. "There are many people who shaped my life," he said, "but only one who taught me how to be human. She wasn't rich, she wasn't famous, she was Maya. And because of her, my daughter smiled for the first time. And because of her, I learned that humility isn't weakness, it's the beginning of wisdom." As the audience rose in applause, the large screen behind them lit up with a photo of Maya, sitting in a small rocking chair holding a newborn child close to her chest, her eyes soft with love and her arms strong with purpose. And beneath that photo, the words read, "A woman's strength is not measured in silence, but in the lives she lifts by simply showing up." Months passed like shifting winds, quiet at first, then sudden with change. Maya Williams stepped into her new world one semester at a time, navigating the unfamiliar halls of the university with equal parts humility and quiet power. At 30, she was older than most of her classmates, yet wiser than most of her professors. The scholarship that Richard Langston had funded covered every cost, but it was Maya's own willpower that carried her forward. She didn't just attend class, she absorbed knowledge like sunlight, and she gave back in ways no one expected. She became the kind of student professors remembered long after graduation, the one who asked better questions than they had prepared answers for. She studied child psychology and early development. She took on electives in trauma recovery and family systems. Between classes, she worked part-time at the university's child care center, holding crying infants while reciting lullabies she once whispered to Laya. Some of her peers knew her only as a brilliant mind with a calm demeanor. Others began to learn her story, not through gossip or tabloid headlines, but through the quiet way she lived it. She didn't speak about Richard Langston, she never name-dropped. But her classmates noticed when visiting parents sometimes lingered around her just to hear her talk to a child. They noticed how she could soothe a screaming toddler with a glance. Maya had no degree yet, but she was already becoming a voice people trusted. Back in the world of billionaires and boardrooms, Richard Langston was changing too. He had integrated paternity leave policies into his company, shocked shareholders by launching a non-profit for single-parent resources, and even spoke openly at leadership summits about the importance of humility in corporate culture. His reputation didn't crumble under scandal, it evolved. But every time he was handed credit for his transformation, he gently redirected the spotlight. "I had help," he would say in interviews. "One woman reminded me what leadership really looks like, and it wasn't in a boardroom, it was in a nursery, with a crying baby and a bottle that wouldn't work." His company's PR team began getting requests, universities, panels, publications. Everyone wanted to hear the full story. But Richard refused to speak on Maya's behalf. He knew her silence wasn't because she was afraid. It was because she was healing. And some healing required privacy. Then came the conference. It was a national gathering of child advocacy leaders, educators, and family policy experts. Richard had agreed to be the opening speaker. But as the planning committee reviewed the topics, one of the organizers asked him directly, "Would Maya Williams be willing to speak? The community deserves to hear her voice." Richard paused. Then he smiled and said, "Ask her, but don't pressure her. If she agrees, it'll be because she has something to say, not because we want to say it for her." 2 weeks later, Maya received the invitation. She stared at it for a long time before responding. She wasn't scared. She wasn't overwhelmed. She was simply wondering if the time had come to turn her private pain into something public. After all, stories weren't just for headlines. They were for connection, for impact, for change. And hers could help someone else survive what she barely had. She accepted. The night before the event, Maya stood in front of her mirror practicing. Her notes were handwritten, but she didn't look down once. She didn't memorize the speech. She simply remembered the moments, the sound of Laya's cries, the weight of rejection, the warmth of her son Elijah's memory, the sharpness of the dresser edge, and the overwhelming silence that followed. She remembered every heartbeat of that day and every step that followed. On the day of the conference, the room was full. Hundreds of educators, parents, psychologists, and journalists sat waiting. Maya stood backstage holding a small silver locket with Elijah's name engraved inside. She took one breath, then another, and when her name was announced, she stepped into the light. She wore a simple cream blouse and navy blue slacks. No designer brands, no flashy jewelry, just dignity, just presence, just Maya. The room hushed. She walked to the podium, placed her notes on the stand, looked up, and began. "I'm not here today because of a title. I'm not a CEO or an author or an expert. I'm here because once a baby cried, and I was the only one left to hear her." She paused. The room leaned in. "She wasn't mine. I was a maid, a cleaner. I had no authority, no permission. But I had something else, a body that remembered what it meant to feed, even after loss, and a heart that couldn't stand to see another child starve." She spoke of Elijah, not as a tragedy, but as a teacher. She spoke of Leah, not as a billionaire's child, but as a baby whose needs were no different from any other. She spoke of Richard, not to expose him, but to show that even the richest man in the room can feel helpless in the face of his own child's tears. She didn't dramatize the push. She didn't detail the blood, but she spoke of how fear can make us hurt those who try to help, and how forgiveness, when given room seat into me, adds I sit in says, and change a life. She ended with a message that left the room silent and trembling. "Dignity," she said, "doesn't come from the job you hold. It comes from the choices you make when no one's watching. I was just the help, but that day, I chose to help anyway. And because of that, I helped raise not just a child, but a father." The room erupted in applause. Not the kind that dies down after a few seconds. The kind that stands, stays, and doesn't stop. Reporters cried, professors took notes, parents hugged their children. And somewhere in the back of the room, Richard Langston stood with Leah in his arms, her tiny hands clapping along, her eyes never leaving Maya. After the speech, she stepped off the stage to a flood of handshakes, tears, and gratitude. A young mother with 2 toddlers hugged her and whispered, "Thank you for speaking for women like us." A teenage boy handed her a crumpled note that read, "You remind me of my mom. She passed. Thank you for reminding me what strength looks like." Maya tucked the note into her purse and held it close. Later that evening, Maya stood alone by a quiet fountain outside the venue. The applause was gone. The cameras were packed up, but the peace in her heart was louder than any ovation. Richard approached, holding Leia. "She did well today," Maya said, smiling at the baby. "She always does when you're near," Richard replied. They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the water. "You could have told my story for me," Maya said, "but you waited." "I wasn't the one who lived it," Richard replied, "and it was never mine to tell." Maya nodded. "Thank you for that." As the sun dipped behind the horizon, turning the sky into gold and violet streaks, Maya looked up and whispered, more to herself than anyone else, "Maybe it's time I stop surviving and start leading." And Richard, his voice quiet, answered, "You already are." Months passed like shifting winds, quiet at first, then sudden with change. Maya Williams stepped into her new world one semester at a time, navigating the unfamiliar halls of the university with equal parts humility and quiet power. At 30, she was older than most of her classmates, yet wiser than most of her professors. The scholarship that Richard Langston had funded covered every cost, but it was Maya's own willpower that carried her forward. She didn't just attend class, she absorbed knowledge like sunlight, and she gave back in ways no one expected. She became the kind of student professors remembered long after graduation, the one who asked better questions than they had prepared answers for. She studied child psychology and early development. She took on electives in trauma recovery and family systems. Between classes, she worked part-time at the university's child care center, holding crying infants while reciting lullabies she once whispered to Leia. Some of her peers knew her only as a brilliant mind with a calm demeanor. Others began to learn her story, not through gossip or tabloid headlines, but through the quiet way she lived it. She didn't speak about Richard Langston. She never name-dropped. But her classmates noticed when visiting parents sometimes lingered around her just to hear her talk to a child. They noticed how she could soothe a screaming toddler with a glance. Maya had no degree yet, but she was already becoming a voice people trusted. Back in the world of billionaires and boardrooms, Richard Langston was changing too. He had integrated paternity leave policies into his company, shocked shareholders by launching a non-profit for single-parent resources, and even spoke openly at leadership summits about the importance of humility in corporate culture. His reputation didn't crumble under scandal, it evolved. But every time he was handed credit for his transformation, he gently redirected the spotlight. "I had help," he would say in interviews. "One woman reminded me what leadership really looks like, and it wasn't in a boardroom, it was in a nursery, with a crying baby and a bottle that wouldn't work." His company's PR team began getting requests, universities, panels, publications. Everyone wanted to hear the full story. But Richard refused to speak on Maya's behalf. He knew her silence wasn't because she was afraid. It was because she was healing. And some healing required privacy. Then came the conference. It was a national gathering of child advocacy leaders, educators, and family policy experts. Richard had agreed to be the opening speaker. But as the planning committee reviewed the topics, one of the organizers asked him directly, "Would Maya Williams be willing to speak? The community deserves to hear her voice." Richard paused. Then he smiled and said, "Ask her, but don't pressure her. If she agrees, it'll be because she has something to say, not because we want to say it for her." 2 weeks later, Maya received the invitation. She stared at it for a long time before responding. She wasn't scared. She wasn't overwhelmed. She was simply wondering if the time had come to turn her private pain into something public. After all, stories weren't just for headlines. They were for connection, for impact, for change. And hers could help someone else survive what she barely had. She raised an eyebrow but didn't open it right away. It's a scholarship program, he explained. There's a university in Chicago, full ride, evening courses, childcare provided on campus. I spoke with the dean personally. They're willing to hold a place for you. Maya didn't speak for a long moment. Her eyes fell to the folder. She placed her hand on it, but gently, as if unsure whether she was allowed to touch something so life-altering. "Why are you doing this?" she finally asked. Richard leaned against the counter, arms folded, his voice softer than usual. "Because people are starting to notice you, and they should. But more than that, I've watched what you've done here, not just for my daughter, but for me. You didn't just teach Laya how to feel safe. You taught me how to be present, and you did it without asking for anything in return. That kind of selflessness deserves more than applause. It deserves opportunity." Maya looked up, eyes glistening. "And if I say no?" "Then I'll respect it," he said. "But if you say yes, I'll pay for every class, every book, every need. And when you graduate, there'll be a position waiting for you, one where you're not behind the scenes, but leading them." Her breath caught, not because of the offer itself, but because of what it symbolized. For years, she had accepted invisibility as the cost of survival. She had embraced the shadows because the world rarely looked kindly at black maids with ambition. But now, here was a man who had once thrown her across a room, now offering her a seat not just at a table, but in a future that once felt impossible. "I'll think about it," she said softly. "Of course," Richard replied, smiling. "Take all the time you need." That night, Maya didn't sleep much. She lay awake in her small apartment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional bark of a stray dog outside. Her Emos, there, who had once begged her to dream bigger, was now gone. Her sister was working a night shift, and Elijah's photo still sat beside her bed, his tiny smile frozen in time. She looked at that photo and whispered, "You gave me this chance, didn't you?" The next morning she arrived early to the estate. She walked straight to Richard's study and placed the folder on his desk. "I'm in," she said. He looked up from his laptop, stunned. "You're sure?" "I'm not sure of anything," she said honestly, "but I know I won't forgive myself if I let fear stop me." "Then we'll start the process today," he said, extending his hand. She shook it, not like an employee, not like a favor being accepted, like two people stepping into the next chapter of something bigger than both of them. A week later, Maya gave her notice, not because of drama, not because she was tired, but because it was time. Richard hired a new caregiver, someone Maya helped train personally. Her departure wasn't an ending. It was a graduation. On her last day, the staff gathered in the garden for a quiet farewell. Leia, now nearly 6 months old, clung to Maya's dress with tiny fingers, her eyes confused. "She'll forget me," Maya whispered, holding the child close. "No," Richard said, stepping beside her. "She'll grow up knowing the story, knowing that once, when she was too small to remember, a woman gave her the greatest gift, nurture when there was none, love when it was inconvenient, and strength when the world said she didn't belong." Tears slipped down Maya's cheeks, but they weren't sad. They were proud. Healing. She kissed Laya's forehead one last time, whispered, "Be kind, little one," and handed her to Richard. As Maya walked away, suitcase in hand, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had already left something behind far more lasting than footprints. "Because I'm tired of pretending, tired of acting like people like you don't matter unless someone rich decides they do. You mattered before all this. You mattered when you walked into the nursery and made a decision no one else would, and I've spent too long ignoring people like you. That ends now." Maya didn't know what to say, so she simply smiled, a real, quiet smile. Then she left. As she walked down the steps of the mansion and onto the driveway where her bus would arrive, she didn't feel like a maid. She didn't feel like a guest. She felt like a woman who had earned her place, not through privilege or pedigree, but through heart, through courage, through compassion. And inside the mansion, Richard Langston stood by the window watching her leave, not as a man watching his employee, but as a man humbled by the truth. Sometimes the people we ignore are the ones who save us. 2 weeks after the dinner, the world outside the Langston estate began to take notice of something deeper than the initial scandal. What had started as clickbait headlines and shadowy speculation started transforming into something else entirely, a shift in narrative, subtle but undeniable. The same media houses that once questioned the ethics of a maid breastfeeding a billionaire's daughter began reframing the story with a new tone, a new angle. From maid to mentor, the woman who taught a billionaire to be a father. What once smelled of scandal now shimmered with redemption. It began with an op-ed written by a journalist who had been secretly investigating Maya's background. But instead of digging up dirt, she found grace. She found a story about a woman who had lost everything, her child, her stability, her peace, and had still managed to show up for someone else's child when it mattered most. The article didn't just talk about what Maya did in the nursery that day. It painted the full picture. Her late-night bus rides across the city, her 2 part-time jobs before landing the Langston role, her volunteer work at the local women's shelter, and her quiet resilience in the face of loss. That article went viral for a different reason than the first wave of gossip. This time people weren't gawking, they were listening. Women shared it with captions like, "This made me cry." Fathers reposted it saying, "I never thought of parenthood this way." Even influencers with millions of followers acknowledged the humility in Maya's journey, her strength, her absence of self-promotion. She didn't have a platform, yet somehow she became a symbol. Back at the estate, Maya was the last person to know how viral her story had become. She didn't spend much time online, she didn't chase attention. She arrived on time, did her work with quiet excellence, and kept her focus on Leia, who is now a giggling, curious, thriving baby. The bond between them had only grown stronger. Leia's first laugh was with Maya. Her first clumsy attempt at crawling was on the kitchen tiles while Maya folded laundry nearby. Even the other staff began treating Maya differently, not as an anomaly, but as someone who had earned a sacred kind of respect. But Richard noticed everything. He noticed the way news outlets had stopped asking for dirt and started requesting interviews. He noticed how Maya's name now trended beside his, not beneath it. He noticed the offers rolling in from companies looking to use Maya's face in campaigns about empowerment, motherhood, and compassion. But he also noticed that Maya ignored every offer. So one afternoon, as Maya was washing Leia's bottles in the kitchen, Richard stepped in and placed a folder on the counter. She turned, slightly startled, wiping her hands on her apron. "What's this?" she asked. "Your future," he said. It was a Thursday evening when Richard approached Maya in the kitchen. He stood awkwardly by the door, not used to requesting things outside of corporate boardrooms. She looked up from the vegetables she was chopping and gave him a small nod. "I'm hosting a dinner tomorrow night," he began. "It's not business, just a few close friends. Nothing fancy." Maya nodded again, unsure where the conversation was going. "I want you to join us," he continued, "not as help, as a guest, at the table." She froze, the knife still in her hand. The request hung in the air like a surprise snowfall, beautiful, unexpected, and almost hard to believe. "I appreciate the invitation," she said carefully, "but I don't want to cause a stir. You know how people talk." "I know," he replied, and I don't care." Maya looked him in the eyes. "With all due respect, Mr. Langston, you might not care, but others will. They'll see me and wonder what I'm doing sitting beside billionaires and CEOs. They won't see a woman who fed your child. They'll see a maid who overstepped." He paused for a moment, then said, "That's exactly why I want you there, because the people sitting at that table need to see the woman who saved my daughter's life in more ways than one. They need to know that compassion isn't defined by salary or skin color or status. It's defined by action. You acted when I froze, and that deserves a seat at the table." Maya didn't respond immediately. She looked down at her hands, still slightly trembling from the weight of his words. Then slowly she nodded. "All right, I'll come." The next evening the dining room glowed with soft golden lights. The table was set with fine china, crystal glasses, and white orchids flown in from Singapore. Guests began to arrive, tech moguls, investors, old college friends. They were dressed in tailored suits and designer gowns, laughing loudly, clinky, in glasses, and speaking the language of the wealthy, IPOs, acquisitions, yacht schedules. But as Maya entered the room, wearing a simple but elegant navy blue dress Richard had arranged to be delivered to her, the conversation paused, eyes turned, the air shifted slightly. Some recognized her from the rumor mill, others simply wondered who she was. She didn't shrink beneath their gaze. She walked calmly to her seat, the one Richard had placed directly across from him. He stood when she approached, pulled out her chair, and introduced her with no hesitation. "This is Maya Williams," he said clearly. "She helped raise my daughter when I didn't know how. I trust her more than most people I've ever met." The words silenced any whispers. For the next hour, conversation resumed, albeit more carefully. Maya was polite but not submissive. She listened more than she spoke, but when she did speak, her words carried weight. One guest, a venture capitalist from New York, tried to impress her with statistics about poverty and single mothers. Maya calmly responded with stories from her own neighborhood, highlighting the gaps that data often missed. Another guest, clearly trying to flirt, made a joke about maids knowing everything. Maya smiled, leaned in and said, "Yes, we do, and we remember more than we're paid to." The table laughed, but respectfully. The message was clear. Richard watched it all with quiet pride, not because Maya was performing or playing a role, but because she was simply being herself. Authentic, honest, grounded. In a world built on image and illusion, she was real. And that, more than anything, gave her power. Later that night, as the guests departed one by one, Richard walked Maya to the front door. The air was crisp, stars glittered above them. "Thank you for coming," he said softly. "Thank you for inviting me," she replied, "and for trusting me." Nodded. "I trust you with my daughter. That says everything." Maya hesitated for a moment, then asked, "Why now? Why all this?" He looked at her, his expression serious but kind, started reading books on parenting and infant psychology. Slowly, without realizing it, he began to reshape who he was. And Maya, she noticed. One evening, while watching Richard cradle Leia in the nursery, Maya spoke softly. "She likes when you hum, that low rhythm. It calms her." Richard chuckled. "I don't even know what I'm humming." "She doesn't care. It's your voice. That's what matters." That moment stayed with him, long after Maya left the room, long after the baby had fallen asleep. He sat there in the dim glow of the nightlight, holding the one thing in the world that didn't care about his net worth, his scandals, or his power, just his presence. And for once, that was enough. But outside the estate walls, the storm was far from over. The media had begun digging. A journalist from a respected outlet was closing in on the maid's identity. Someone had leaked partial employee records. Another had traced her name through an online donation page she had once created after Elijah's death. Richard's legal team urged him to act, to control the narrative, to fire Maya before her identity was fully revealed. But Richard surprised them all. He issued a statement, brief, clear, and without shame. "My daughter was cared for by someone who showed compassion and bravery in a moment of need. Any judgment placed on her is misplaced. I stand by the decision to let her stay." The statement sent shockwaves through the media world. Some praised him, others mocked him, but it didn't matter, because for the first time Richard wasn't speaking to the public. He was speaking to his daughter, to Maya, and to himself. The next morning, when Maya came into work, she found a handwritten note on the kitchen counter. "Thank you for seeing my daughter when I didn't. R." She folded it quietly and placed it in her pocket, saying nothing, but her eyes held a glimmer that hadn't been there in weeks. The following weeks transformed the Langston estate in ways no one could have predicted. What had once been a pristine but cold mansion slowly started to feel like a home. Leia began to smile more, her crying fits became rare, her sleep patterns normalized, and her eyes now lit up whenever Maya entered the room. Even the staff, once uncertain and quiet, noticed the change in the atmosphere. There was less tension in the halls, less fear of perfection, more moments of softness, of quiet conversations, of shared humanity. The mansion no longer felt like a sterile display case for wealth. It pulsed with warmth and presence. Richard Langston changed too, but not in the way tabloids fantasized. There was no dramatic breakdown, no lavish public donation, no impulsive decision to give everything away. The change was subtler, slower, but more powerful. He began canceling late meetings to be home for bedtime. He delegated more responsibilities to his board so he could attend pediatric checkups. He took parenting courses online at night and read books about attachment theory, baby nutrition, and single fatherhood. When asked by business partners why his schedule was tighter, he responded simply, "My daughter is my priority now." No further explanation was given, and none was needed. Maya, however, remained in the background. She performed her tasks quietly, respectfully, and with the same dedication she had always shown, but there was something different in the way Richard spoke to her now, less of a superior talking to a subordinate, and more of a man seeking the wisdom of someone he deeply respected. There were still boundaries, but they were no longer enforced by status. They were maintained by mutual dignity. Every morning he greeted her by name. Every evening he asked if she needed anything before she left. And once, when Maya was late returning from a doctor's appointment, he fed Leia himself, following the exact instructions Maya had given the nanny earlier that week. It wasn't perfect, but it was sincere. Then came the dinner invitation. Maya, for her part, had gone quiet. She continued her work without complaint, stayed out of the nursery, and barely spoke more than a few words unless spoken to. But something in her posture had changed. Her movements were slower, more cautious. The other staff whispered around her, unsure what to say, unsure whether she was a villain or a victim. Some admired her bravery, others worried for their jobs, and a few simply watched, curious to see what Richard would do next. That afternoon, Richard finally broke the silence. He walked into the nursery, not to confront, not to argue, but to observe. Leia was crying again, her wails echoing against the pale walls. The nanny had returned, but she was flustered and clearly out of her depth. She tried formula, then rocked the baby, then hummed a lullaby, none of it working. Richard stood in the doorway and watched, his arms crossed, and after 10 minutes, he asked a simple question. "Where's Maya?" The nanny hesitated, her face pale. "She's in the kitchen, sir, preparing Leia's laundry." He didn't say another word. He turned, walked downstairs, and found her folding tiny clothes near the washer. She looked up, surprised, but didn't speak. "I need your help," he said. Maya blinked. "With what?" "Leia's crying again. Nothing works." There was a pause. A heavy silence hung between them. Then Maya set the clothes aside, washed her hands, and followed him upstairs. No one spoke on the way. It was like walking toward a line neither of them wanted to cross again, but both knew they must. In the nursery, the crying grew louder. Leia's face was red, her body tense. Maya approached slowly, her hands open, gentle, as if approaching a wounded animal. The nanny stepped back instinctively. Maya picked up the baby, rocked her softly, whispered something only Leia could hear, but the crying didn't stop. She looked over her shoulder at Richard, who stood like a statue, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. "She's hungry again," Maya said quietly. Richard swallowed. "I thought the formula. She's not accepting it. Her stomach's rejecting it again, same as last week." He nodded slowly. "So what do we do?" Maya looked down at the child. "You tell me." It was a simple sentence, but it held so much weight. He was the father. The decision rested on him. The man who controlled empires couldn't decide how to feed his own daughter. He looked at Maya, then at his child, and for the first time in his life, he felt powerless in a way that terrified him. Finally, he nodded once. "Do it." Maya didn't move immediately. She looked him in the eyes, making sure he truly understood what he was asking. Then she walked to the rocking chair, sat down, unbuttoned her blouse, and cradled the baby. Within seconds, the cries stopped. Peace returned to the nursery like a soft breeze. Richard sat down across from her, silently watching. The moment wasn't awkward. It wasn't scandalous. It was human, raw. honest. And in that room, the walls of status, race, wealth, and power fell away. It was just a woman feeding a child who needed her, and a father watching someone succeed where he had failed. Over the next few days, the media pressure grew. Talk shows discussed the billionaire breastfeeding mystery without naming names. Think pieces debated whether it was exploitation or compassion. Feminist bloggers praised the maid. Conservative voices condemned her. The internet split down the middle. But Richard remained silent. He didn't respond to interviews. He didn't release statements. He didn't sue anyone. Instead, he began to spend more time with Maya, not in secret, not romantically, but as a man learning from someone he had once dismissed as just the help. He asked questions about Elijah, about grief, about Ash, how she kept going. Maya never offered more than he asked, but her answers were enough to change something in him. He started holding his daughter more, started coming home early. It was humbling. Richard rubbed his temple and sighed. "You're not fired," he said eventually, "but I need to think about what this means. Public image, boundaries, everything." "I understand," Maya replied. She stood up and headed for the door. Then before she left, she turned around and said, "Laya doesn't need perfection. She just needs presence. And right now, she's starving for that more than anything else." Then she left. Richard sat in silence for a long time after the door closed. Her words echoed in his mind. Presence. He had built an empire, controlled entire industries, bent governments to his will. But he couldn't get his own daughter to stop crying. A maid had done what he couldn't, and it humbled him in a way that nothing else ever had. He stood slowly and walked to the window. Outside, the city pulsed with life. Skyscrapers glittered in the sun. But for once, Richard Langston didn't feel powerful. He felt small, human. And in that moment, he realized something that would change everything. He didn't hate Maya for what she'd done. He envied her. Because somehow, she had become the only person who truly saw his daughter. And that was something money could never buy. The Langston estate had always been a fortress of silence. Tucked away behind high gates and manicured hedges, it was the kind of place that kept the world at arm's length. No reporters had ever dared sneak through. No scandals had ever leaked beyond carefully worded press statements. For years, Richard Langston had paid handsomely to ensure that his private life remained exactly that, private. But nothing stays secret forever, especially not in a world fueled by gossip, driven by outrage, and hungry for stories that bring the mighty to their knees. It started as a whisper, a single anonymous message sent to the inbox of a popular parenting blog, the kind of blog that mixed celebrity AB news with parenting advice for exhausted mothers. The email was short, almost vague, but enough to raise eyebrows. Billionaire CEO allows maid to breastfeed his daughter. You didn't hear it from me. That was all. No photos, no names, no proof. But the rumor was planted, and like all good seeds, it found fertile soil. Within hours, a second message surfaced, this time with a blurry photo taken from the hallway security camera. It showed a woman, possibly Maya, entering the nursery while holding a crying baby. No proof of what happened inside, but just enough ambiguity to spark curiosity. By the next morning, hashtags began trending. #Langston baby scandal, #maid milk, #who is Maya. News outlets didn't publish the story at first, too risky. But social media didn't care about facts, they cared about narratives. And this one had everything: a billionaire father, a mysterious maid, a crying baby, and the implication of something taboo, something raw and controversial. Conspiracy theories blossomed overnight. Some said the maid had forced herself into the role of a mother. Others claimed it was a love triangle gone wrong. A few radical voices even called it abuse. None of them knew the truth, but they didn't need to. Speculation was enough. Inside the estate, Richard Langston watched the storm unfold from the screen of his tablet. His public relations team had already called 4 times before breakfast, urging him to make a statement, to deny, to threaten legal action. But he hadn't answered. He sat alone in his study, the same place where he had spoken to Maya just days before. And in front of him was the same screen, showing the same headline over and over again. Only this time, his daughter's name was trending globally, and Maya's name, though not confirmed, was being dragged through digital mud by strangers who didn't even know her face. And Maya's face, it wasn't shame he saw, it was sorrow, a grief that went deeper than words. He hated how it had made him feel. 10 minutes passed before he picked up the intercom and called for her. "Send Maya to my study, now," he said, his voice curt. Another 5 minutes went by before there was a knock. The door creaked open. Maya entered, standing tall despite her injury, her uniform slightly disheveled, but her posture composed. She didn't speak until he gestured to the chair opposite his desk. He didn't know what to expect from her. An apology? Tears? A dramatic defense of her actions? But she offered none of those. She simply sat, placed her hands in her lap, and waited. Her presence unsettled him even more. For a long moment, he just stared at her, watching the rise and fall of her breath, the subtle way her eyes shimmered with unspoken emotion. And then, finally, he spoke. "You crossed a line," he said flatly. "You had no right." Maya nodded slowly. "I understand." He blinked. "That's it? You're not going to argue?" "What would I argue, sir?" she replied softly. "That I did something unprofessional? I agree. That I overstepped my role? I agree with that too. But I will not apologize for feeding a starving child. If you want to fire me, I'll accept that. But I won't say sorry for doing what I believed was right in the moment." Richard leaned back in his chair. He hated how calm she was. It would have been easier if she yelled or cried or begged, but she did none of that. She simply sat there, quiet but firm, her back straight, her eyes clear. It made him feel like the guilty one, and he hated that. "You said you lost a child," he said finally. "Tell me about that." Maya's eyes flickered, and for the first time since she entered the room, her expression cracked. She took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and nodded. "His name was Elijah," she began. "He was born 2 months early. Tiny thing, barely the size of my forearm. But he was strong, stronger than any baby I'd ever known. We fought together, him and me. Every night in that NICU, I held his little fingers and whispered stories, told him to hold on. And he did for 2 whole months. Then one night, his lungs just gave up. No warning, no signs, just gone." Her voice broke just once, but she didn't cry. She swallowed hard, then continued. "I went home with empty arms, but my body didn't know. It still produced milk. Every morning I woke up soaked, aching. I couldn't bring myself to stop it. I think a part of me believed Elijah would come back if I just waited long enough." Richard stared at her, something shifting in his chest. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to say. His own grief was different. He had lost his wife in a brutal divorce, not to death, but to betrayal and bitterness. He had lost his sense of trust in people, in love. He had spent the last few months drowning himself in work, trying to raise a daughter he didn't understand and barely had time for. And now, here was this woman, this stranger, whose quiet strength made him feel like a fraud. "Why didn't you ask someone else for help?" he said finally. "Why didn't you call me again?" "I did," Maya said gently. "I called, texted, no one answered. I didn't want to do it, Mr. Langston. It wasn't some fantasy or delusion. I was terrified. But the baby wouldn't stop crying, and I was afraid she would collapse from exhaustion. I couldn't just sit there and watch." There was another long silence. Richard stared at the liquor in his glass, then set it down, untouched. "I overreacted," he admitted quietly. "I was angry. I was scared, and I acted poorly." Maya didn't respond to that. He looked up at her, eyes narrowing slightly. "Do you want me to apologize for pushing you?" She set her chin slightly. "No, I want you to think about why you did it." That answer surprised him. She wasn't interested in revenge or drama. She just wanted him to reflect. The peaceful moment was shattered like glass. Maya instinctively reached out, desperate to protect the child, but it was too late. Richard turned toward the stunned housekeeper who had just arrived behind him, Confused and speechless, he shoved the baby into her arms. "Take her," he barked. Then he turned back to Maya, his expression full of disgust, rage, and something else buried deeper, something he wouldn't admit yet. Without thinking, he pushed her, not hard, but with enough force that she stumbled back, hit the dresser, and crumpled to the floor. A sharp gasp escaped her lips as her head clipped the corner. A thin line of blood traced its way down her temple. The room fell silent again, but this silence was heavy, thick with horror. Richard stood over her, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "How dare you," he spat. "You're just the help. This isn't your child. You think you can just do that?" Maya didn't answer right away. She was shaking, her hands gripping the hardwood floor for balance. Her vision blurred, but she didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just looked up and said quietly, she wouldn't stop crying. She was starving. The bottle didn't work. I tried everything. Richard's nostrils flared, and his voice came out lower now, more dangerous. "And so you thought you'd, what, unzip and feed her like some stray animal?" Maya swallowed hard, then whispered, "I lost a child 3 months ago. His name was Elijah. He was 2 months old. I still have milk." The words hung in the air. Richard blinked. The anger in his face flickered for just a second, then returned. "You should have called me," he snapped. "You should have waited." Maya looked down. "I did. For hours." Neither of them spoke after that. The housekeeper stood frozen in the doorway, the baby asleep in her arms. Richard stared at the woman on the floor. The one he'd hired to clean the floors, not hold his child. And something inside him twisted. Confusion, guilt, and a fear he didn't understand yet, because deep down he knew that despite everything, his daughter had finally stopped crying, and the person who'd done that wasn't him. The silence in the room lingered for what felt like eternity. Richard Langston stood rigid, still breathing heavily, his hands clenched tightly into fists by his sides. Maya remained seated on the floor, holding her temple where a thin streak of blood was drying slowly against her skin. Her legs trembled beneath her, but she didn't move. The only sound was the low hum of the baby monitor and the faint breathing of the sleeping child in the housekeeper's arms. Richard didn't know what disturbed him more. The fact that a woman he'd hired to clean his home had breastfed his child without permission, or the fact that for the first time in hours, his daughter was no longer screaming. The realization unsettled him. He had hired nannies, doctors, nutritionists. None of them had been able to do what this maid, this stranger, had done. Without a word, he turned on his heel and walked out of the nursery, not bothering to look back. The housekeeper stood there, her mouth slightly open, not daring to speak. Maya slowly pulled herself to her feet, ignoring the throbbing pain in her side and the way her scraped knees stung beneath her slacks. She reached for her blouse, buttoned it back up slowly, and with quiet dignity, walked past the housekeeper and exited the room. She did not cry. She did not apologize again. There was nothing left to say. Downstairs, Richard stormed into his private study, slamming the heavy oak door shut behind him. The thick wood muffled the outside world. He poured himself a glass of scotch even though it was barely 3 in the afternoon. His hand trembled as he bowed it to his lips. The images in his mind wouldn't stop. His daughter, latched onto the maid's chest, peacefully drinking like it was the most natural thing in the world. Maya Williams had never expected her life to lead here, a quiet nursery on the top floor of a billionaire's mansion, far away from the modest apartment she shared with her sister and aging mother. The room was filled with soft sunlight, pale pink walls, and the gentle hum of a white noise machine that tried and failed to soothe the crying baby in her arms. The child, Leah Langston, was barely 3 months old, but her cries had a weight that cut through every layer of calm Maya had left. 3 hours had passed. 3 hours of rocking, 3 hours of pacing, 3 hours of formula bottles rejected, diapers checked, lullabies hummed. Nothing worked. The child was hungry. Deeply, painfully hungry. Maya could feel it in the way Leah clenched her tiny fists, the way her face turned red with effort, and the way her sobs had slowly become hoarse and panicked. She looked at the clock. Almost 2:30 p.m. No one else was home. The housekeeper had gone to run errands. The chef was off duty. Richard Langston, the baby's father and one of the richest men in the state, was stuck in meetings downtown. The child's mother was no longer in the picture. Not since the divorce had gone public 6 weeks ago. The only person left in the mansion was Maya, the maid, 27 years old, tired, heartbroken, and still quietly healing from a loss she didn't talk about. Her son, Elijah, 2 months old when he passed 3 months ago, she had buried him in a white blanket with clouds on it. Every night she dreamed he was still alive. Every morning she woke up to silence. But today, something inside her stirred as Leia's cries reached a desperate pitch, and her small body began to twitch from the effort of screaming. Maya felt her chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with emotion. Her body still produced milk. She hadn't expected it to last this long, but very weak. It had come back, even though there was no one left to feed, and now, a child needed her. Not her child, but a hungry child. Maya stood there frozen for a moment, her hands trembling. What would people say? What would Richard do? What would the world think? But then, another cry, longer this time, hoarse and aching, and something in Maya broke. She whispered, "I'm so sorry, little one. I can't watch you suffer." And with slow, careful movements, she sat down on the rocking chair, unbuttoned her blouse, and brought the child to her chest. At first, nothing. Then, a latch, and silence. Pure, golden, life-giving silence. Leia's little hands unclenched, her body relaxed, the red in her face faded, and peace settled into the nursery like a warm blanket. Maya cried silently, not from shame, not from fear, but from a deep, maternal sorrow that had found a brief moment of healing. She wasn't trying to be a mother, she wasn't replacing anyone, she was simply feeding a child who had no other way to be fed in that moment. 20 minutes passed. 30. Leia had drifted to sleep in Maya's arms, milk-drunk and safe. The room was quiet, the tension in the air dissolved, and for a moment Maya felt useful again, alive again. She didn't hear the front door slam downstairs, didn't hear the heavy footsteps storming up the marble staircase, didn't see the shadow pass across the hallway until the nursery door flew open. "What the hell are you doing to my daughter?" Richard Langston's voice exploded across the room like thunder. Maya jolted as though struck, her eyes wide, her mouth frozen in mid-breath. Leia stirred but didn't cry. The billionaire stood in the doorway, suit jacket unbuttoned, tie loose around his neck, his face twisted in confusion and fury. Maya tried to speak. "Mr. Langston, but he was already across the room, his eyes burning, his hands reaching. In one swift motion, he yanked Leia from Maya's arms with such force that the baby let out a sharp, startled gasp.